notice that this motion is about all there is to say. This motion is a universal quality visualized. It's the motion of breathing. It's the motion of the way in which mathematics works. It has an hourglass shape. It starts with what is and collects it and brings it together and presents it. And from that presencing, allows it to go back out and be just what it is. Two motions. One is coming together and the other is going out. Integration, differentiation. Integration, differentiation. And that when they're put together, they form an activity which could be graphed as like a sine wave. All energy takes the form of a sine wave. Question: how does that energy come to be? Answer: there must be an initial propagator. Otherwise, there would be no wave front. It's an inescapable deduction. It cannot be missed that because there is energy, there was an originator of the energy. Because there is a wave front, there was a propagator of that wave front. Because there is something to integrate. Integration then, dealing with energy, dealing with this sine wave activity, is intimately tied up to differentiation. Now, the peculiarity of the wisdom tradition is that there is no way that one can determine the beginning and no way that one can determine the end. But you can, with any desirability of precision, determine the middle. So, no matter what civilization, no matter what kind of people, no matter what time they have lived in, even if they're 47th century future alien humans from the Procyon star system, they will always have a wisdom tradition which has an archetypal form. And that is, the only precision that one can find is the center. So that the centering, the integration mode, seeks to find the center. And because there's an energy wave that has a particular kind of quality, which we'll get to in just a moment, centering always is the experience of finding the presence of the stillness, which is the fulcrum of two infinities, or of a single continuous infinity, a continuum. Now, let's note something here. The most convenient metaphor for that energy is light. Light itself has always been what people have talked about in terms of wisdom. About 200 years ago, a Brit named Thomas Young, about the time that Thomas Jefferson was being inaugurated as president for the first time, 1801, Young did a little experiment with light. He took a sheet with a pinprick in it that would allow light to come only through a pinprick. He arranged a second sheet exactly like the first sheet, only with slightly spaced 2 pinpricks. And then he took a third sheet, exactly the same as the first sheet and the second sheet, and put the third sheet up, and left the third sheet blank with no pinpricks. There was a diffraction pattern on the third sheet, light and dark. The light made concentric, circular patterns with light and dark alternated, interspersed. It was the first time that someone had externally, in a graphic way, come to understand that the pattern of light includes light and darkness both together. Now, Young didn't understand in 1801. Probably the only European who would have had an insight in 1801 would have been Schopenhauer, who had actually read the Upanishads. He didn't understand that this was an exteriorization of an ancient yoga technique of using the 2 eyes of a person in a very deep samadhi to allow for the ambient light to be focused by the yogic mind, so that one can read in one's mind the passage inward of a single light source. And the experience in having the single light source come through the 2 dark parts of the human eyes produces in the mind itself that diffraction pattern, the universal pattern. It's the pattern of light and dark. It's the pattern of creative and receptive. It's the pattern of yin and yang together. They always go together. And what Thomas Young understood for the very first time and graphically showed in 1801 was the beginning of the realization that when we are talking about light, we are talking about a cone of energy. And only the center point of the cone of energy is light, and the rest of the cone surrounding that photon is darkness, which is carried with the light. Light carries darkness with it as a structural adjunct to its existential reality. There's nothing alien about darkness in a universe of light. First difference between the Hermetic tradition and Gnosticism. The Gnostic hates the darkness, for it is evil and a flaw. The Hermetic tradition recognizes it is an essential structural part of the reality. Little tiny divergence, big difference later on. What's the big difference? One hates life, the other loves life. The one wants to get out, the other would like to sweep up the dust, polish up the goods, and go into business. Now this propagation of the pattern of light is extremely interesting when one comes to try to understand what does it mean in terms of energy. have a nice little volume here. This man is a professor of physics and molecular medicine, City College of London. Fourier optics. We're all familiar with optics, the optics of Sir Isaac Newton. We're familiar with now a little experiment by Thomas Young of optics. Optics has to do with light and how it's seen, the geometry of the reflections of light, the geometry of the cones of light, the senses of color, how color, there are different vibrations of light, so many hundred thousands of angstroms, and if you get so many more angstroms, hundreds of thousands of angstroms, instead of red light, you'll have orange light, and so on. And all this can be measured to any exactness that you wish. Any exactness that you wish. The mysticism of the 21st century is the mysticism of knowing, not the mysticism of not knowing. What is mystical is that one can know exactly, and one asks, why is it that we should be able to do this? Which is the new mysticism. Not the mysticism of what we don't know and why don't we know, but the mysticism of that we know to any degree of exactness. And what does that mean? The introduction to this little book on Fourier optics by a professor of molecular medicine, City University of London. The mathematical methods are named after J.B.J. Fourier. They're extremely powerful. It allows us to give a mathematical representation of light, for instance, in Fourier optics. It can give us, in terms of mathematics, any infinite series of representations. It has to do with images in infinite series. That all images, and because we're using light here, most of the images that we're familiar with are light images. But it works for sound images. One could have Fourier audio, if you like. I could see 60 or 70 years from now books on Fourier touch. In highfalutin Indian logic, all axioms are based upon the sense of touch. Touch is the propagator of all logical form in high Indian logic. It has nothing to do with sight. It has nothing to do with hearing. It has everything to do with touch. What's important here in Fourier optics for us is that we're trying to understand in this 12th lecture on ritual that ritual has nothing to do with superstition. It has everything to do with existence and of men and women determining what is real for them and acting upon it. The whole purpose of ritual is to determine by the men and women who need to know what is real and how they can live with it. And how they can check that their lives are real because they're consonant with what they know is real. It's not just the glib aligning of a culture to the annual cycle of the sun. It's very glib. To think that some monument like Stonehenge, to quote a friend of mine who was lecturing on it the other night, to think that Stonehenge was simply made to determine the midsummer sunrise is to miss entirely the point of a civilization needing to determine for itself the pattern of existence. The summer solstice sunrise is a point of light that carries with it a cone of shadow, and both those have to be integrated in their entire ecology of movement, and that's what Stonehenge is about. That the rocks are as important as the spaces between the rocks. If you don't have the right spacing, all you have is a kind of haphazard semi-cliff. You can express nothing in that way. Garbled sound, if given the right intervaling, will transform itself into music. You can take a natural sound, like the sound of humpback whales, and you can create a symphony out of it, as Alan Hovhaness did, the great American composer. And if you remember, in our education we began. The first music selection was Hovhaness. His symphonic creation on the songs of humpback whales. Now, it's important for us that we keep track of all of these things. For not only were we listening to Hovhaness and God Created Great Whales as a piece of music, at the very same time we were looking at David Attenborough's Life on Earth, his double cassette presentation of the stages of natural life. And at the same time, we were taking a look at Thoreau and taking a look at the I Ching. And at the very same time, we were all taking walks from where we lived. And at the same time, we were either starting to read the Odyssey by Homer or starting to read Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Now, when all of these vectors are taken as a whole and put in motion together, your beginning point, instead of being simply a dot, a nondescript, boring dot, becomes instead something which another British mathematician in the 19th century, a man named Hamilton, said that when you take the initial point and instead of considering it a dot, consider it a matrix of vector motions, which perform then a kinetic gestalt as the beginning point, then you have a very interesting mathematical differentiation which is possible that was never suspected before. If you are a die-hard caveman who thinks that a beginning point is simply a dot, you're never going to get beyond connecting dots together and having stick outlines of something that you can never bring to life. You're going to have ticky-tacky, rickety, Frankenstein gestalts that don't do anything. And especially, they don't have any magic. Whereas if you get with it, and instead of being prosaic and have dots, have gestalt matrices of kinetic assemblages of interesting motions, then you have something. If you begin this educational course by starting all of these activities at the same time together and carry them through and let the energy permutations happen, a pattern emerges about this time. We're 1/4 today, 1/4 through the education. 25%. It's the end of the first 6 months out of a 2-year cycle. And because there's symmetry here, the second 6 months will be a furthering of what is going on here, and the last 6 months will be the underside, the contrapositive opening out of what we have done the first 6 months. So that there's a geometricity that's going on here. It's very much like an hourglass. this kind of woo-woo shape of the World War II flyers. Woo-woo, nice shape. Where are you going to put your arm around? Right in the middle. So we're trying to put our arm around a sense of stillness and presence, which is going to be real good for us. We're going to feel good. We're going to be empowered to do things. We're going to be creative. And all this without having to buy Deepak Chopra's books. Excuse me. You don't even have to buy Ayurvedic toothpaste to get the right smile to great existence. What's important here is for us to begin to open out our awareness and realize that there is a fantastic dynamic gestalt that's happening here that so far transcends the usual education that it bears almost no resemblance to it. One has to go to the very cream of the wisdom traditions around the planet to find analogs for what we are actually doing. We often pick the random walk that we took at the beginning in previous usages of this course, but I never, ever showed anybody. I never brought out, because I thought, why complicate people's lives? That there are such things as mathematical developments of a whole field called random walks. This happens to be a publication of the American Institute of Physics. Random walks and their applications in the physical and biological sciences. It was the papers of a little conference held in La Jolla in 1982. There's a whole mathematical literature based on random walks. Why random walks? Because there's a lot that we can know about random walks mathematically. And they lead directly, that whole interest leads directly to the establishment of what's known in mathematics as the continuum. Continuum. And when you hear someone like Albert Einstein talking about the universe as a continuum, he means that it's a very complex continuum. And that because it's a continuum, because there is an infinity to this continuum, because there's an infinity, it has a very specific analysis which it is susceptible to. An analysis of an infinite continuum must proceed along radically different lines from an analysis of a finite, determined thing. When you're analyzing a finite, determined thing, you usually either feel it to see whether it's going to be resaleable, high quality goods, or you kick it to see if it's sound. But you cannot kick infinity. You cannot rub the goods in a continuum. Instead of reaching out to get at something, instead of lashing out to kick something with a continuum, you have to get real still and real quiet and presence it in order to find out the flavor, the usability, the actuality. And centering in integration is all about getting in touch with the continuum in which we actually occur. And that part of this centering is becoming aware that there's a whole pattern going on, because the way in which existence actually happens is by pairs. I'm not giving you a bad gesture here. In baseball, this means there are 2 outs. If you get the next batter, you're out of the inning. Existence happens because of pairs. And like in the pairs of the wave propagation qualities of energy, namely light in the case that we were talking about, you're going to have a pattern of light and dark. You have to be able to see the pattern of light and dark together. If you're prejudiced against the dark, you don't want to deal with it, and you only want the light, you're not going to see the pattern. You're going to selectively edit out at least half of what is real. At least half. And all of what is the entirety of the Gestalt. You're going to daydream about playing harps in the clouds and of not being down there and getting jabbed by pitchforks in the molten areas. And with this kind of approach avoidance thing, you're going to end up at least neurotic, if not schizophrenic. You will be precisely happy and unhappy at the very same time, to the same extent, and this is what is known as tragicomedy, which leads to the exact observed limbo of waiting for Godot. Or The End Game, also by Samuel Beckett, where there's a pair of garbage cans on the stage, and the guys who live in those garbage cans from time to time pop the covers and talk nonsense to each other, and then go back into the garbage cans and pop the covers back on. End game. The ragged, worn-out cultures of this planet look more and more like a Samuel Beckett stage play. It's a useless, absurd ecology that doesn't go anywhere, and especially doesn't go off this planet into more interesting areas. And especially doesn't get present in a continuum, and especially does not see that the pattern of light and dark together make a gestalt which allows for integration to come to that center, come to that presence. Because you can recollect a pattern once you're able to comport in a realistic way to the entirety of the pattern. There are specific, undeniable, ruled, principle, analytical techniques that allow you to come back to the single point, even if it's one photon. You can take any pattern of energy, as long as you take the pattern totally, absolutely in its fullness. And there are well-known methods of refocusing that back to the single propagator. And then you can prove to yourself that there was an original propagator, that it really happens that there is a creator, because one can refocus and come to understand that the creator is right here, right now, to any degree of specificity you want. It lays to rest a lot of propaganda in favor of an exact propagation. And everybody knows and can understand it's more fun to propagate than to be the victim of propaganda. Now, when we come to dealing with random walks, what's interesting here, little quotation here from the last paper in this conference on random walks, the very last paper. It's entitled Kinetic Aspects of Ion Transport Through Neural Membrane. Well, that's kind of highfalutin initially, but it's not too bad. Kinetic aspects. It means instead of a boring dot that you have a gestalt of vectors all together. Kinetic aspects of ion transport. It means not only do photons carry energy, but also ions carry energy, and especially in metabolic systems like the human body, the way that energy gets from place to place is by ion transfer. How does the candy bar that you eat get processed to not only give you energy, but give you that acne? How does that happen? Through ion transport. IT, it, It's the way that it happens. Now, how do those little ions get into the cells? Because there are gates, ionic gates, on the surfaces of all cells that allow for them to come in and to go out. Doorways. Now, these doorways have something to do with neural membranes, because those walls around the cells are actually membranes. Just like we don't deal with dumb, stupid, boring dots, we don't deal with dumb, stupid, boring walls. The cells do not have walls. And if we can tear down the Berlin Wall, we can tear down the idiot's wall. Cells are not walled like little medieval castles, protecting themselves against everything outside of them. In fact, the membranes cooperate together so that one cell's membranes are contiguous in a sine wave fashion, so that all cell membranes work together, so that you have a network of cells which is available not because all the cells have the same political philosophy, but because they share the same labyrinthian membrane structure. And that the surface, the plane over the mystery of this network is the skin. That the skin is the membrane, and our skin is not a wall defending us against other people who also have walled skin protecting themselves against us. That's not how it works. That energy passes from person to person through the skin because all of our skins, no matter what color they are, amazingly enough, all of our skins make a network of membranes that make of mankind a single family. And that this single family has an energy transfer between all of the members, and it has something to do with random walks. Because understanding this, they say, in the conclusion of this paper, the last paper in Random Walks and Their Applications in Physical and Biological Sciences, American Institute of Physics, their conclusion is, we have shown that the problem of membrane excitability has a number of issues which can be addressed from the viewpoint of random walks. The primary challenge which remains in this field is to understand the concepts of channels and gates in terms of detailed molecular mechanisms. Channels and gates. Now I've found a nice little quotable, rhyming language to help get this across. Gates are transformation nodes, and channels are ecological modes. And you can call this the Nodes and Modes show. Channel 0. Station WEIR on Channel 0 talking about the Nodes and Modes show. Gates are like thresholds, they're like doorways, but instead of doors in walls, they're like thresholds of acceptability in membranes. What do they accept? They accept a certain quality of energy which approaches a differential quality. What are those membranes? We'll get to them when we get to science at the end of next year. But they happen to be universally taking advantage of a very peculiar quality that fat has. Fat. You know that chubby stuff? Yeah, it's called lipids in biochemistry. Lipids. Lipids come in two surprising flavors. Not chocolate and vanilla, but water-loving and water-hating. Some lipids love water, other lipids do not like water at all. So there's hydrophilic lipids and hydrophobic lipids. And when you have a pair of lipid molecules, one that hates water and one that loves water, you have a little vignette of what the membrane for organic creatures on this planet takes advantage of. Because the water disliking, let's tone down the language, the water disliking layer of lipids forms a nice exterior, and the water loving forms a nice interior. So the exterior wall of the membrane protects against fluid invasion. Now we're strengthening the language. And the inner allows for water, liquid, to remain there and be there. And permeating this bilipid layer, this lipid bilayer, permeating that, just like the skin has pores, are ion channel gates. And if one could go down to the deepest molecular level, one would find that energy permeates organic beings. The primary challenge which remains in this field, what field is that? The field of trying to understand kinetic aspects of ion transport through neural membrane. How does neural energy work in living tissue? It works because once one can understand the nodes and modes show, once one can get a feel for this, one has the experience of seeing the pattern of the light and dark, the pattern of the channel and the gate. The gates accept because they have a certain kind of openness, and the channels make sure that there's form there. So that not only is there an open quality, but the open quality is surrounded by a closed quality. So that form and no form go together. Form and no form go together. Which is to say that this whole pattern of the light and dark together, the form and no form together, is the ecology of existence in nature, is precisely what the ecology of existence is in nature. What is there, and especially just as important, what is not there, together are the pairs which present nature and determine, create existence. And all good human ritual knows this. Not on an ideational way. They could never talk the way I'm talking. They wouldn't be able to hear a single word of what I said. But they do exactly what we have been talking about. Good human ritual makes forms which accept the formless into it. All really good ritualists know that you have to leave secret openings so that God can come in. Or as the Hopi Indians used to say, you have to make sure that children are raised right so that they don't close off the soft spot which they're born with on the top of the cranium. Newborn little babies, if you feel their skull, the skull is not complete. They come out of the womb. You tie the little umbilical, and you handle the head very gently, because not only is the cranium soft, but it's not complete. There's a hole here at the top. Well, not just a hole. That's a stupid way to talk. That's like making dull, stupid dots. There's a soft spot where the skull is not yet calcified. And I hope you say this is where the prayers of man are able to go through, permeate the membrane of the skull, and go to become a voice sent on high. When you send a voice, you have to make sure that the soft spot is permeable. And if you live a dull, stupid kind of life, as an adult who has paid no attention to keeping the child alive in oneself, you can't send a voice very far. It becomes like an inner static, and nothing happens. The birds don't sing to you. The openings of the mystery of nature do not open for you. And generally you have to find pills that convince you that you're making good surrogates happen for you. This education is an ecology, a weaving together of all of the aspects that are necessary for the real. Now, if we come to our little book on Fourier optics, we have a nice little quotation, which is put on the page of the notes for Ritual 12, which is today, right below the notes from Random Walks. There's something about Fourier analysis that happens to go with membranes and channels, and random walks, Fourier transforms, all of these things, yin and yang. Even with Basho, for a haiku is a gate in language. Basho's travel diaries are like the channels, and right in the middle of the channel is a little haiku, which is a gate, which allows for the energy to go out of the travel log into the reader, and also accept energy from the reader into the travel log. Language forms, when they're really done right, are living things. We have to even erase the word things. They're living forms. Books are not dead. If you think that books are dead, then you're still living in a very boring, dull, little dot-based universe. Books are gestalts of kinetic networks of language which carry the energies of reality through the transformational media of language and allow for the membranes of the mind to be activated. Channels, this is from Fourier optics, channels have need of transformation nodes. The overall aperture function, or structure, just call it structure, the overall of aperture, that is openings, the openings have a function, aperture functioning. The structure of all the aperture functions together can be built up mathematically by the summation of an infinite series, I have to use a big word here, sinusoidal harmonics. Sinusoidal harmonics, which is what a Fourier series is. Old Mr. Fourier, Monsieur Fourier, realize that if you have an infinite harmonic, because it has a structure, one has a very specific, strange, wonderful, exact analysis which can be carried out in terms of it. And so the more complex is the situation, the better the accuracy. And so the education today brings you good news. Channel Zero brought to you today by a very good product, and that is, the more complex the situation of life gets, the better a certain kind of analysis gets. And when it's infinite, it works perfectly. That's very good news. Very good. That's why we're keeping this sponsor. I guess we're out. Okay, and another pair. These images I'm showing you are images from a play that W.B. Yeats wrote, and it was performed in Dublin at the Abbey Theatre in 1916. It's a play based on the Japanese no drama that we're using here in our education. The original version of the plays came in this edition of 4 plays for dancers. And in the 4 plays for dancers, there's a frontispiece of one of the dancers performing in the costume and mask of a hawk. And the play, Yeats's play, is called At the Hawk's Well. And here, the women are replaced by men. The woman in Isuzu is replaced by the Irish hero, Cuchulainn. And in fact, there is a whole literature that's developing on the connection between Irish myth and Japanese no drama, centered around W.B. Yeats. There are books on Yeats and no drama. And so it's interesting for us to realize that a great deal of the excellence of world literature has in the 20th century become a planetary experience. What is extraordinary here is that although the public perception at any given time, like in 1916, almost nobody paid any attention to Yeats's drama. The Irish Easter Rebellion was happening in 1916. World War I was still going on. Many other things happening. Still, some 80 years later, there's more interest than ever. And very often, something that is profound doesn't seem to have very much effect when it first comes out. But after several generations, there begins to be some psychic traction, and after several centuries, it becomes apparent that this, in fact, was major development. What's interesting is that Yeats used a quality of language that availed itself both of poetry and drama. He's often considered the greatest of all poets in the English language since Shakespeare. And like Shakespeare, Yeats's language moves by taking an image and spangling it That is to say, taking an image which would have been a kind of a dot representing something in nature, the boring dot, the image of a tree, which is just a tree. Here's the image, there's the tree, one for one. A simple dot representing this. This image represents that. This reduces an image. It's a reductivism. It's a boringness. One can say, well, this image that has a single correspondence to a thing in nature is capable then of being called a sign, and one can have the semiotics of signs in the development. But that kind of an array doesn't come alive. Whereas if you take an image like Yeats did and spangle it, turn it into a whole constellation, by shimmering the image, one gets different aspects of it, a kind of a cubism of the image. One begins to get the gestalt that an image in the hands of somebody who is masterful at language, masterful at experience, like Yeats, or like Shakespeare, or like Basho, their images come alive. And in order to integrate the spangled shimmer of all the possibilities, the kaleidoscopic possibilities of a single image experienced in a radically open way, that what comes into play then is a new order called the symbol. In order to integrate all the dimensions of a kinetically vibrant imagery, one then has this quality of the symbol coming in all by itself, naturally. The symbol is the center of the spectrum of a dynamic imagery. The symbol is always the quiet point in the spectrum of an image. So imageal spectroscopy is the field of the origins of the presence of symbols. So that very often in sophisticated ceremonies, where one not only has a mask, which is a mask of something from the life base, like the diet, like a food, when you have many such masks brought together, and you pair them up, for instance, with masks of feeling coming from the inside out, and you have these pairs of masks, and you have many pairs of masks from many different people, and they're shimmered, they're spangled, they're brought into play in such a way that there is a whole field, a spectrum field, a kinetic kaleidoscope of possibility. One then has a kind of a living gestalt which is available for someone to presence a symbol out of it. And a real good, rich ceremony always has a symbolic center. And the purpose of a religion in antiquity was not to establish a priesthood, but to find the symbolic centers. And so that very sensitive people often performed that function. Yeats himself considered his role as being someone to find the symbols of civilization, much like the ancient Celtic bard would have done. Someone who wore a coat of many colors. And Grandpa Yeats was very good at this. He was as good at finding symbols as Carl Jung. And in a way, I did a whole series of 13 lectures on Yeats and Hume, two magicians of the 20th century. Because in order to be able to see symbols, one has to already be on a higher order than symbols in order to see them as forms, especially when there are no guidebooks to follow. You have to be able to distill it out of what is there. And only a magician can find the symbol in the kaleidoscope of imagery. And the whole origins of healing was that the medicine man, the magician, was the one who could establish the health for the people by finding what symbols were there in what is happening in the infinite kaleidoscope of the normal confusion of life, and pull them out and say, this is what is there. And when we can interiorize the symbol, it organizes the image space all by itself, because that's what they do. So you never cure anyone of emotional confusion by giving them a dictionary of images. To help somebody by giving them a dictionary of dreams is very stupid. It shows a very, very primitive, stupid quality, a lack of understanding. You sensitize someone so that they can come to appreciate the symbol, which is integrating the dream image base, and then they come together all by themselves. Because feelings are an energy. Feelings are an energy. Feelings have a sine wave energy to them. And if we can integrate light, we can certainly integrate feeling. And if light is integrated by a sinusoidal harmonic, then feeling also can be integrated by a sine wave flow of harmony. And that's what music does. And the most ancient physicians were those who carried a single string, or an instrument that had a single octave on its strings, either 7 or 9. The octave itself, the 8, was median, presencing between these two, between the 7 of one quality of existence and the 9 of another quality of symbol. The octave is a noble eightfold path of the Hermetic tradition. And that's why most developments in music after the Renaissance took over this kind of scale. Our education at this particular point is really concerned with bringing together in a conscious way all of the activities, all of the examples that we've been dealing with. We're talking about something which is important here. When you have energy that's traveling in this kind of a sine wave, an energy that is kinetically moving in this kind of a harmonic, it is possible then that any given cycle will be a periodic function of the entire continuum. That in all the infinite millions of years of Ra, all you need to do is to keep track of one day of Ra completely, and you will have understood the millions of years. And while you can use a kind of archaeoastronomy and powerful community ritual to keep track of the daytime, 12 hours of a day, you need to have an esoteric, symbolic, inner world integration to keep track of the 12 night hours. You can keep track of form, but you cannot keep track of non-form. You have to have a whole different approach to keep track of that. So something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead is actually a sophisticated presentation 1,000 years later of a book called the Book of 12 Gates. 12 Gates. The nodes and modes show. 12 gates. And each gate is an hour. 12 hours form the journey through the netherworld. And we're going to get into that when we come to mythology right away. Because the very first pair of things that we're going to use in myth is we're going to come to Inanna. And we're going to read Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, and her stories and hymns from Sumer, ancient Sumer. And we're going to pair that with Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, all about language, all about myth. We're going to use Plato and Inanna. Actually, Inanna was written by a very charming princess. Her father was Sargon of Akkad, the first really great king. He's the one who made the Fertile Crescent from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His was the first kingdom to span that entirely. And his daughter wrote Inanna because she was very, very wise. And that was about 4,300 years ago. So we're going to take a look at that. That the way in which experience is able to go in the entire sine wave, the crest in the daylight and the trough in the nighttime. That if one can go through a complete day and through a complete night, so that one has a complete day, that day can be understood as the molecule of the substance of infinity. No matter how infinite time is, and God's time cannot be measured. It is not only measureless, it is boundless. But we can specifically know a day. And this whole impress of the value of being able to understand the day, a day, the day, becomes famous later on. The most famous presentation of it for Western civilization over the last 3,000 years comes from the Jewish phrase Yom Yahweh, God's day, Judgment Day. There is a day which is the last day. And what is the last day? The last day is the last node that can be kept track of before final integration. Because final integration, as we will discover towards the end of this year, is as mysterious as nature is. That nature cannot be finalized, nor can integration to the exact point be finalized. That the exact inner point, the soul, is as mysterious as nature is. It's like infinity on both ends. Except that the integrated end is absolutely clear of the fact that we do not keep track of the last stage of integration. And therefore, the last stage of integration traditionally is called, the prelude to it is called acceptance, and the actual experience of it is called absorption. Absorption. So that on page 28 of our outline of the course, there's a whole page on acceptance. It begins, the last stage of integration is surrender. The releasing of resistance to complete affects the completion. It's not anything that you do, but it's something that you stop doing. What is it? The resistance to complete is released. That's completion. That space of focus created by our bringing together, or the way the Greeks used to talk about thrown together. The word symbolion meant thrown together. It meant the kinetically dynamic focus of all of it. And because when it kinetically implodes all together, there's a flash, and it's a flash that one cannot see into the flash. It is so brilliant existentially that one cannot see into it. And when one takes the eye of the mind away from that flash, what records is not the flash of the light, but the dark cone surrounding it. It's like looking at the sun, and then you look away and you blink. And there's a brilliant blur of light, and after a while, when that calms down, when the rods and cones calm down and no longer register the flash of the light, you register the cone of the darkness. And you blink and you see a dark spot that was there where there was light before. So that one registers openness. And on page 29, following acceptance is absorbing experience. Why is all this here? Because there have been millions of men and women who have gone the path of truth and have confirmed over and over again for who knows how many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, that this is the way to freedom. This is the way. Absorbing experience. Absorbing experience in the mythic horizon has a ritual and ceremonial aspect, both carried over from the ritual or mask level. But the mythic horizon also adds language, so that singing or chanting completes the raising of ritual to myth. Now you're going to make a ritual ceremony. And it'll be interesting to know whether any sound comes out. Because in a purely ritual aspect, it would be totally silent. Now sometimes, usually, there is language that's brought into play, or music, or something like that. When you bring your masks together, your masks are like little vector arrows that cluster together and make the very point of that ritual. It's all of those little arrows, all of those little vectors that when they are brought integratedly together form the flash that brings the light and the cone of darkness of acceptance there. So that the mask is the first sketch of the soul. And making a mask has nothing to do with being primitive, nothing to do with being superstitious. It has everything to do with religion. The Latin word religio means binding. What does it bind? It binds together. It actually doesn't refer so much to religion. Religio meant in the Roman sense of the fasces of power binding together what the heralds of the emperor held up. Latin's a bad language to use in terms of God. It's good for paving roads like an engineer to get from prison to prison. You can march a lot of legions militarily along Roman roads. But there's an ancient language. It's called Avestic. It's a language that Zoroaster wrote in. Zoroaster, who was a contemporary of the author of Inanna, contemporary of Sargadavataka, lived about 4,300 years ago in northeast, what is partially Iran today, what is partially Uzbekistan today. his language of Vestic, there was a word there called svarna, and it meant the glory. It meant that when all of the insights, all of the perceptual cues from nature and doing and existence and language are interiorized and brought together in this mind, a flash of light happens called svarna. And there's a flash of brilliant sunlight that comes from the head of the person, from the mind of the person who does this. And that when that flash is there, it's hardly there before it's gone, but it leaves a cone of darkness, which is so brilliant that the edges of the darkness are seen to transform into light again. And so what one sees is the halo of light around an open space around the head of a person. And you can recognize that that's the nimbus of holiness, which was adopted both by Buddhism and Christianity, because they're both very recent religions. Christianity and Buddhism are just yesterday. Just yesterday. But the primordial physics of enlightenment has to do with bringing it all together. Now, if you have had a very paltry kind of education, you only have a few arrows to bring together, it's not very much. It's sort of like a putt. But if you have a really rich education, a lot of cultures, a lot of civilizations, all kinds of stuff, you can hear that smack on the other side of the quasar that's farthest from us. And every sentient spirit in the universe looks up and says, oh, welcome. It's time to start putting around and get back to something really worthwhile. The haiku is the seed in language, which is like a intuitive premonition of that glory. Svarna is sometimes translated as glory, the glory, one's glory. You know the aura, somebody's aura, Carillion photography. Well, that glory is there because there is an integration in the body. Because the body is an integral with the mind. And when the mind is awakened, the body organizes its aura. I remember when my old friend Thich Thien An was giving a demonstration for some of the Carillion photographers back in the mid-70s. They took his hand when he was just keeping an everyday mind. And then they took his hand when he was in deep samadhi. And you could just see on the Carillion plate that what was just sort of like a scattered fringe on the one hand became this highly integrated splash. Beautiful on the other hand. This quality is what ritual is the foundation of. But in order for that foundation of ritual to become interiorized, it has to be transformed into a medium that allows for it to go inside. That medium is language. And that's what myth is all about. Myth is all about the interiorizing of existence. And we call that interiorizing experience. Experience is taking existence in so that it comes to a focus, or at least it can come to a focus. Usually it doesn't come to a focus because people are scattered. And they use a kind of a language that doesn't go very far. They speak a kind of a pidginese that doesn't have any imagery to it. It doesn't have any kind of cascade of sine wave energy. And if you don't have a poetry in your language, there's no way that integration can happen. Instead, you get a scatteredness. And you get the rare event. You get a mind like a bubble chamber in the old-fashioned beveltrons, where maybe 1 out of 10 billion energy particles hit something else, and you get this odd display of an event. Whereas as language becomes more refined, more poetic, this happens more and more and more, and one can actually have a very high talk language. Yeats used to call it high talk. You can have a language where all of the energy that comes into play in yourself comes together at the same time. Then you get something which turns on the light. Basho is one of the best figures in the whole planetary culture that we have. He's one of the best figures that we have who was able to take language and refine it to its last frame before it disappears into the mystery of the soul and doesn't record as a thing anymore, simply is a kinetic factor of the glory of the soul. And the haiku is that. Now hopefully you've been writing haiku. Hopefully you've been trying to work your language into haiku. And you might be interested that in Japanese literary tradition, you can look at it if you want. There are books like this History of Japanese Literature. I think there are 3 volumes so far here from Princeton University Press. Jinichi Konishi, or this recent collection here from Stanford, a Waka Anthology, Volume 1. It's going to be one of 4 volumes. Stanford is going to put out a 4,000-page collection of Waka. Waka, about 1,000 years before Basho, was a 31-syllable poem. 57577. And one of the earliest of all of the great poets of Japan who lived back in the 700s, Hitomaro. Hitomaro? Here's one of his waka. The clouds, the blue clouds, trailing on the northern mountain, tear away from the stars, tear away from the moon. It took 1,000 years of genius for Basho to take the waka form of 31 syllables and realize that you could get the wheat germ of the kernel, and that was enough. That instead of having the kernel of 31 syllables, you could take the little bit of 14-syllable addition to it, the last 2 lines. You could take those away and you could have that 17-syllable wheat germ, the core of the kernel, and that was enough. That worked. It was like Bach flower remedies. Just a little bit works. It's like an inoculation. If you have an inoculation against smallpox, you want to make sure that the vaccine has just a little bit. If it has too much, you're going to get smallpox. Often, what works in the spiritual realm is the littlest particle that you can get, because that's the key to being able to understand infinity. You have to understand the smallest in order to get to the largest. They go together. The very large and the very small are paired. They're always paired. So when you're dealing with revising a planetary economics like Gandhi was, he got as simple as he could because he knew that was where the key was. And if you get Gandhian simple, it turns out to be universal. And Basho was very much in poetry what Gandhi was in politics. Basho was able to get real simple. And in Basho, the cream of Basho is his ability to work the haiku weak germ of the kernel of a molecule of experience into a sinusoidal harmonic like a Zen travelogue, and to show that at the juncture of certain nodes in that harmonic, a weak germ haiku will deliver the reader into a kinetic ion transport mode where his neural networking interfaces with Basho's neural networking. We share the haiku with the poet. When you're as good as Basho, you can do this. Here's the most famous haiku in all of Japanese literature. And here's how it works into the Zen travelogue. The Oku no Hosomichi, the narrow road to the deep north, Basho. There was a temple called Rushikuji in the province of Yamagata, founded by the great priest Jikaku. This temple was known for the absolute tranquility of its holy compound. Now, doesn't that remind you of the paired text Zyami, the old haunted monastery that's very quiet because there are only ghosts there and a meditator? This temple was known for the absolute tranquility, the zero, of its holy compound. Since everybody advised me to see it, I changed my course at Obanazawa and went there, though it meant walking an extra 7 miles or so. When I reached it, the late afternoon sun was still lingering over the scene. After arranging to stay with the priests at the foot of the mountain, I climbed to the temple situated near the summit. The whole mountain was made of massive rocks, thrown together. A symbol mountain. Holy mountain, mysterious mountain, and covered with age-old pines and oaks. The stony ground itself bore the color of eternity, paved with velvety moss. The doors of the shrines, built on the rocks, were firmly barred, and there was not a sound to be heard. As I moved on all fours, crawling like a baby again, as I moved on all fours from rock to rock, bowing reverently at each shrine, I felt the purifying power of this holy environment pervading my entire being. In the utter silence of the temple, a cicada's voice alone penetrates the rocks. It's the most famous haiku in all of Japanese literature. Notice how Basho, in a seemingly effortless way, writes of charming everydayness and very swiftly brings it to this archetypal, eternal quality of being a baby among rocks and roots again, because oaks and pines are distinguished as much for their complex root systems that go in between rocks and the fissures of them as they are for anything else. So crawling like a baby on all fours back to the basic quaternary, the pair of pairs again, among rocks and roots in utter silence, paying homage to each barred shrine door. They don't have to be open. They should be closed, because there's nowhere else to go except to be. There's no place to go. There's only a be which can occur. And when he is, The cicada's voice, the little bug, it's very much like a Japanese Zen version of the Egyptian scarab, where the scarab in Egypt carries the little ball of dung, and that's the symbol, oddly enough, for Ra, rising. The cicada becomes the symbol in Basho for that. Have you ever heard a cicada? It's like an incessant drone. It is it's one of the purest sinusoidal harmonic sounds in nature. In fact, not only does Basho use it, but Plato uses it too. Plato, in one of his greatest of all dialogues, my God, I think it's the Phaedrus. And we're going to read the Phaedrus. We get to read the Phaedrus. That of all of Plato's dialogues, they all happen in town except the Phaedrus. And Socrates says to his good buddy Phaedrus, he says, Phaedrus, we have something really important to talk about. We're going to talk about love, about what it really is. Let's not talk about it in town. This is something that deserves the privacy of going out of the city, off the pattern, out of the mandala. And so they go out of town, out of Athens, along the Ilissus, the little stream there. And Socrates says, look at this old plane tree that's there, like the Greek version of the oak there, with its roots and its rock along the banks. And they sit down, and Socrates says, all that we can hear now, the din of humanity is gone. It's behind us. All that we hear are the cicadas. And as you see, he tells a little myth about the cicadas. It's Plato's way, it's Socrates' way, it's Basho's way, it's my way of saying. When you get to that pure, infinite, harmonic, imaged by the sound of a cicada, there are only two ways to go. There are only two ways to go. One way is the way in which the Arab mind has interpreted this. The Arab mind uses in Arabic the term aziz for madness. Insanity. It means in Arabic that madness is like having the infernal buzzing of insects in your mind. Whereas for Basho, for Socrates, for Plato, for Channel Zero, when the sound of the insects is integrated to a pure harmonic line, like a single lute, like a stringed instrument, it has the natural property of medically healing madness. Because if you can bring the sound of insects into a laser-like perfection of one harmonic line, it performs an Orphic-like quality of transformation. It takes the confusion of everything you've ever heard about everything else and integrates it to that single line, sinuous like a Matisse line, that leads to the perception of the gestalt of everything by showing nothing there. And that's the quality that an education, a real education, delivers. That you are able to do this in your own experience, in your own lives, wherever you live, however you're living. To bring all of that together, to find the harmonic thread that leads to the acceptance of the absorbing experience of love. There's no simple way to say it, because if you say it in a simple homiletic way, it sounds like a homily and it adds to the confusion. If you use too much vaccine, you're going to get the illness. And that's why education is an art. And the art is to get it as small as possible so that you get inoculated and don't get sick. And the trouble with both spiritual teachings on the planet is that by following them, you will just get sicker. And the usual disease is called disillusionment. And they work for a week, they work, and even work for 10 years, and eventually they wear off, and the hypnotic glow goes, and the euphoria fades, and you find you need another shot of something else. And so the whole addictive quality of false teaching becomes insidious. You need a fix. What's new? This is where spiritual education is, 1994. Sick planet, sick teachers, spreading disease. Part of the quality that we're dealing with here if you take a harmonic and know how to transform that, and you know the nodes and the process, we can do something like this statement here from the book on Fourier optics. Strictly, the pattern that can be represented by Fourier series should be repeated an infinite number of times. However, for the applications we shall meet, the number of repeats will be sufficient for the use of the series to be justified. In most practical gratings, optical gratings, the number of repeats is very large. In a crystal of 1 millimeter linear dimension, there are more than 1 million repetitions of the atomic unit. A 1 millimeter section of a crystal grating has more than 1 million repeats. But if you have a crystal several millimeters, you can easily get up into tens of millions. So that the quality of resolution by knowing a transformation series works better and better the more complicated it is. And especially if you get rid of the kind of stodgy metaphor that crystal is somehow a piece of rock that comes from Peruvian jungle secrets, and start to realize that the human body has liquid crystals by the billions in it, then you can begin to realize that when realization happens, it happens so precisely and totally and exactly that there's not just no question about it, but there's the disbelief that there was ever a question in the first place. That's when you have gone through the eye of the needle. When it becomes more astounding to believe that you ever disbelieved than to believe the belief. Then you've made it through, and then you're no longer in the integration mode, then you're in the differentiation mode. I think there's going to be a hiatus next week instead of going on with ritual, because we're finished with ritual. We're going to take the second interval before we get to myth. It's like wine tasting. Before we go to the next glass of wine, we're going to rinse our mouth. We're going to rinse our mouth by using the Mundaka Upanishad. Mund in Sanskrit means razor. The Mundaka is the Occam's razor, Upanishad. That is to shave away more and more of what's not needed to leave only what is needed. And the Mundaka Upanishad shows us, just like the Bach flower remedies, just like good inoculation, just like the spiritual tradition always does, that when you get really good at shaving away what you don't need, you find that the last thing to throw away is the razor. You no longer need the razor. And empty-handed, you can make the mudra of peace.